Coming up next on the Science and Education segment, I sit down with Dr. Peter Daempfle to talk about why your third cousin might be your best friend. Welcome back to Impact. I'm Barbara Brabetz here with your Science and Education segment for the week. My guest today is Dr. Peter Daempfle. He's here to discuss his body of work, including many science books that you may be interested in. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate you being
Well,
here.
we're in our new digs, and we have new guests, so we appreciate that. I understand, you come from a storied history. Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up over in Queens, New York, Ridgewood, and then Middle Village, and found beautiful Schoharie County, where I went to Hartwick College, undergraduate, and fell in love with the nature of the area.
And when you were at Hartwick, what did you major in?
Biology, pre-medicine.
And what was your thought? You thought you're going to go to med school?
Definitely. I mean, I thought that, that's what I really know, to be a doctor, and I appreciated, though, the many aspects of biology, the many areas that are fascinating, besides just getting a job and getting a career.
So a bachelor's degree wasn't enough for you. You still had that thirst for learning, so you continued on with your studies. Where did you end up next?
Right, I went on to the College of St. Rose and I earned a master's in education, science education, and continued on, did a master's in biology in University at Albany, and then a PhD in science education.
And that was also at UAlbany?
Correct.
Right, so you've kind of hovered around this area since you left Queens.
Right, right. It's a beautiful area. I love the nature, and my book is really trying to get not just students, but all people interested in science, to empower them to use the tools of science in order to make them better consumers of science. You go to the doctor, and the doctor just says, well, it moved. What does that mean? So you can understand your own health better and be your own advocate better. So the books are an attempt to get people more interested in the area.
So you have 2 degrees in science education. We talk about the pipeline. We talk about that science literacy aspect to just anybody who doesn't even particularly like science. Why is it so critical that we have a science literacy?
Let me first address the pipeline. We lose more than 50% of students between high school and college in terms of their first year of science, and the pipeline continues to dribble forth. So we, receive about 1% of people who are originally interested in science. I think that the roots to science literacy help a person to appreciate the world around them better. Let's take, for example, the books get into the history of science, the philosophy of science. Being able to, for example, philosophically argue a point when they read a newspaper article that says coffee causes pancreatic cancer. Does it or doesn't it? You need to have some math behind that area, and you need to be able to have the confidence to argue the alternate viewpoint, so that you're not just being bounced around from one point to another.
So let's start with your first book, Science and Society. We'll give a shot here so the audience can see it. It's available where?
Both books are available on Amazon. They're also at the publisher, Jones & Bartlett published Science and Society.
Okay, and we can probably find it at our local independent bookstore, at least ask for it there, and they can get it to you. So Science and Society is aimed at what audience?
It's aimed at primarily college first-year students or those rising to college, seniors in high school, to help them gain the foundations, like I had mentioned before, the history, the philosophy, the math, the roots to science literacy. There's poetry in there, but most importantly, there's case studies to bring science alive.
Give us an example of one of these case studies.
The first thing that comes to mind is inbreeding. We all know inbreeding is bad. Leads to deformities, problems, and shunned by every society.
Oh, except for when it comes to dogs. We choose to inbreed dogs on purpose in order to retain traits that are favorable, say like in a golden retriever, where they're a good family dog, and have a low incidence of bites, for example.
Oh, right, correct. However, some research has shown that inbreeding in humans, some studies from Iceland, where it's a population that has excellent records. The studies show that between the third and fourth cousins produce the most offspring.
Okay, so third cousins. I got to go through the family tree here. All right, so it's pretty distant.
It's pretty distant, about 1/512th to 1/256th similarity in genetics.
So
between
we
you and
might
I.
have that same genetic similarity, say, with somebody walking down the street. Hey, I might have third or fourth cousins here in Schenectady that are walking down the street, and I might not know them. So there's no real danger of these so-called inbreeding traits?
No, the problem with inbreeding is that it brings out the recessive traits that are bad. When you're that distantly related, it actually is a better production of offspring than if you're even more distantly related.
So there's some sense of compatibility between sperm and egg?
Yes, for example, let's do blood typing. If your blood type, let's say, positive and your wife is negative and your child is positive, basically the mother and child have incompatible blood, and it's a problem in the second birth. So ultimately, that distance in characteristic leads to problems. Now,
right. Nowadays, we can test for it.
And we give ROGAM shots
right.
to
suppress
prevent.
the immune response so that the second baby can survive. But that's why we used to do blood tests when you ran off to get married in the olden days.
Right.
Along with the test for syphilis on the man. Strangely, it was only on the men that they were testing. But true, it's an interesting wedding present, I guess.
Let's
go get a blood test.
Right.
But we don't do that anymore.
No longer.
Thankfully, we have cures for all of those issues.
Correct. But I guess it's an example of in the book, I try to bring out points that are paradoxes. Certain sections of the books discuss myths and such. So.
Great. So let's move on to the second book, which is probably not for the classroom, although it certainly would be welcome in the classroom, but is more kind of bedside reading or reading for the general public.
Right. I mean, Choice Magazine just yesterday has recommended the book.
Great. Congratulations.
Thanks very much. For the general public, but also for high school students and for college students and their parents and science teachers. So it's more of a science education book for the general public.
And the title is long.
Right.
So give it to us. Give us
Good
the
science,
full board.
right. Good science, bad science, pseudoscience, and just plain bunk. How to tell the difference.
Right. So good science and bad science. We're scientists. We've seen good science we've seen bad science that was first promoted as excellent science. And then the world of scientific inquiry was able to show that it wasn't good science. Let's first talk about the scientific method and how we can tell good science from bad science using the scientific method. Right.
Well, there's no actual one scientific method. There are many iterations and ways of thinking in science. In both books, I give procedures, steps, observation, hypothesis, conclusion, which is the traditional scientific method. But in actuality, there's many reiterations. You may have to return back after a failed experiment, or you may have to adjust your hypothesis. There's a lot of creativity involved in hypothesis formation, for example, a lot of inductive or that type reasoning. So good science requires really a very wide knowledge of various areas, understanding the history, understanding the mathematics behind science. So good science requires that knowledge to be able to evaluate whether or not a study is actually good or not.
So even if we have science that's good, that's used the scientific method, do scientists just kind of let it go and say, okay, we've proved it, we're backing off, it's done?
Science is never proven. That's the one word you should never use because things always change. New data, new samples may be taken. Let's look at the history. How Pasteur discovered and developed the rabies vaccine. Rabies was a 100% death sentence. And for example, in the book, I do a story about that. And I try to bring a little literature out to make it more exciting. scientific world. So the story about Pasteur shows his frustration with how he watched people die and suffer, and that motivated him to do science. So that's good science, and he discovered.
And how did he discover it, in case the audience doesn't know?
Well, he took a spinal cord from dogs, ground it up, and placed small amounts in patients to develop their immune response. Obviously, the dog had died of rabies, and the small amounts of rhabdovirus were in the ground up spinal cord.
Because they knew it was a nervous disorder.
They knew it was a nervous disorder. They knew it must creep up to the brain somehow from the bite, maybe on your arm, to your brain. So he used hypothesis testing, inductive reasoning, which is gathering data, looking around at, and creatively coming up with an experiment and a hypothesis. Yeah.
And I just read that there was the first survivor of a rabies bite recently in modern times. What they did is they induced a coma in this individual, pushed them down super deep, and then used immunotherapies that we've developed since the AIDS epidemic and virus technology, antiviral technologies have come to bear, and the individual was able to survive the rabies bite. In fact, the scientific review panel, because when we work on humans, or any vertebrate for that matter, science has a very specific protocol, very rigorous protocol of, is this safe?
Right.
And he had trouble getting it through the review board that he was going to try to save this individual who had been infected with rabies, without doubt. But luckily, this individual still lives today.
And it shows how science is always changing, how it is always new people with new ideas and new creativity to have not a groupthink mentality, but to break out of what we already know. Einstein, one of his poems I put in the book, by sweat and toil unparalleled, at last a grain of truth to see. O fool, to work yourself to death, our party make truth by decree. Does some brave spirit dare to doubt, abashed in skulls his quick reward? Thus teach we him as never before to live with us in sweet accord. He was referring to the totalitarian era of the times. We can apply that to really modern thinking in science. We don't want to have a group think where we just believe everything we're told. We must have creative people to propel science and find new ways of approaching problems, new technology, and even new ways of thinking and teaching.
Well, one of the very prominent sciences that are out there right now is the anticipation of global climate change and what will happen. What's often seen by the reporters as uncertainty in the scientific world is just the honest scientific debate that we have to have as scientists among it. So when they say that there's dispute among scientists, that's part of the natural progress of any scientific endeavor.
Yes, I mean, maybe I'm an argumentative person. I've been accused of that before. You and I have always had an open conversation through the years about any issue, and I've always appreciated that.
Yes.
Chapter 2 in the book, Good Science, Bad Science, addresses argumentation in science and being able to evaluate the mathematics, the viewpoints of the study really are vital. So it's not that we're in disagreement and it's not true, global climate change. It's that everything must always continually be discussed and debated and thought about.
So let's get back to the bad science, or just plain bunk. How do we tell bad science? How does someone out there tell bad science from good science?
I think it's so important, math literacy, being able to see that if there's not enough numbers in a sample size, if there's only 5 participants, it probably isn't something you can generalize. So you want statistical data. Now, obviously, there's not a lot of room and no one wants to sift through data, but there should be some numbers. This was statistically significant, it should say.
So say we have a poll, even if it's not about a science thing, but it's about a political whim, and we look down at the bottom of the screen, and it says sample size equals 128 women between the ages of 35 and 45. What that tells us is that they selected a very specific sample to look at.
Right.
It's as if I called my 35 to 45-year-old girlfriends and said, hey, what do you think about so-and-so?
Right.
So it doesn't necessarily hold true for the whole population.
Right, it needs to be generalizable. And there's a lot of information that one needs to look at besides mathematics. Was it an experiment? Was it an observation? Observation is also valuable. Just gathering data and drawing conclusions. That's called inductive reasoning. So mathematics is one. Looking at the study itself and seeing if variables were controlled is another.
Could you explain what you mean by variables?
Variable is something that changes in an experiment. So, for example, if we were to test this room versus another room and see if I did a better job interviewing, if it were warm or cold, we'd have to keep all of the same variables or conditions the same.
Except for warm or cold.
Except for warm or cold.
The one we want to test.
Right. And that's probably the most difficult part of establishing the power of an experiment, because the more what we call extraneous variables, things that happen in between that we may not even know about, like a fire engine drives by, intervene with the results. So that's one important.
So is that why the consumers out there, the listeners out there, hear so much about, say, cancer, who gets cancer, what the cancer rates are? It's hard to narrow down the variables because we all live our lives. And if I eat a Twinkie a day for my whole life and I develop breast cancer, I might say, oh, it's Twinkies.
Right.
But I might smoke, I might be overweight. Certainly, I think if I eat a Twinkie every day, that will happen.
Right.
I might have a high-stress job. I might have genetic predisposition towards the disease. There's so many other variables that in a non-controlled experiment, we can't really just wash away.
Very true. You'd mentioned that we have a lot of restrictions to human testing. When it comes to bacteria, we can make clones, you and I know that, very easily, and they're all identical. So all the variables remain the same. In statistics, we say that we have within group variation that is very small. So within the group, they're all the same. And that's an important thing. That's what you need. Of course, we can't make clones of all humans. It's unethical. And of course, I end both books with the ethics behind science. What are the scientists' responsibilities? Ferdinand Verbeest was the first person to create an automobile hundreds of years ago in China, and he built it for the emperor. Is he responsible for the thousands of car accidents every year? So sometimes we don't know what our products will give rise to. And we explore that toward the end of the book.
Well, I hope you'll come back at another time and we can do the ethics of science, which is fascinating, and I'm sure many of us struggle with it just in our daily lives and what we see out there. And obviously we want there to be ethical science. Unethical science doesn't go anywhere good.
Right.
So what's next for you?
Well, I'm on sabbatical this semester.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I will return and continue on. I teach at SUNY Delhi, and I primarily teach the nursing students, and I enjoy that quite a bit. The nursing program has grown quite a bit to a BSN online bachelor's.
Great.
In nursing, and so yeah, I look forward to going back to my teaching.
Well, terrific. If you crank out another book, will you come back too?
I certainly will. This will be
terrific.
The first place.
You've been watching the Science and Education segment here on Impact. I'm Barbara Brabetz. Thanks so much for watching.
Proctors, bringing the best in arts, education, and entertainment.